Hey everybody.
How's it going?
It's going good.
Love your costume.
Look at this. Everyone's dressed up quite well. Very good.
This is the best.
Welcome to my home. I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and we thought we would shoot a Halloween series of episodes. And so we're all in costume. I am Steve Jobs, and I will try to sell you Apple products throughout. Maybe everybody could go on around and introduce themselves and say what they're dressed like.
I'm Will, and I'm dressed like Clint Eastwood from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
I'm Zach, and I'm dressed like David as Pumpkins.
I'm Annie, and I'm dressed as a pumpkin.
I'm Ashley, and I'm dressed as a celestial witch.
And I'm Maddy, I'm a banana.
Yes!
Very good. So we thought we would talk today about spooky topics in psychology. And so the first is psychology really a science? Yes or no? And so would anyone like to get us started? Is psychology a science or is it not a science?
Well,
Zach, please get us started.
yeah, I think whenever you're trying to decide whether something fits into a category like this, that's defined by just one word, it has to be relative. So there's things like poli-sci, where you literally can't do experiments because it's impractical and would be unethical. And there's also things like biology, where basically all you do is experiments. So I think it's much closer to biology, in my opinion, because there's so much, even if you use biology as an example, there's so much of that wrapped up in it, and things like psychopharmacology.
Well, that was John Watson's goal, was to say that psychology was a branch of the natural sciences. But, yeah. Other thoughts?
I think it is a science. I mean, it's the study of the mind. I think that obviously it's there's some biological stuff going on there, and I guess one of the things I've always heard why psychology is not a science is because nothing's set in stone. It's a lot of theory and stuff like that. Well, a lot of science is just the same way as well. Like, just because it has slightly more, they think that they have more evidence. A lot of science is not set in stone. So I don't see any difference personally with that. And then also, I mean, you still have like experiments. You have independent variables, dependent variables, stuff like that, that are translate to both. So I absolutely think psychology is a science for sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Expanding off of that, I feel like, I hear that sometimes that psychology isn't a science, but I feel like the better question to ask is what would make it not a science? Because you're coming at the mind from a scientific perspective, you're using hypotheses, you're using experiments. Like, the only thing that I think separates psychology from the other sciences is the subject matter, which is the brain. And like, if you don't believe that the brain is a thing that can be studied, then I feel like you're behind a few years.
Well, you know what? Let me go back a few years too, because William James, who was an early psychologist, said two things. He said, one, that psychology was just an elaboration of the obvious. And he also said that psychology wasn't a science. It was only the hope of a science. And so the question, I teach history and systems, and one of the questions we ask is, have we really gone beyond that sort of a thing? So since we have several scientists here, no, go ahead, Ashley, were you going to say something?
No, keep going.
Oh, okay.
I'll
Annie,
say
go ahead.
that I do think it's a science. I can see where people might not think it's a science. I think maybe the role of religion comes in and talking about the mind or versus soul and all that personality stuff. It's just so hard to understand when I think a more traditional way of viewing it back in the past is not seeing it so much as the mind is what controls everything of what you are, but it's something else inside of you, or like your soul maybe.
Right.
And that's
absolutely.
really hard to explain. But in my opinion, I do think it's a science because I think, like Ashley said, you're really approaching it from a lot of scientific perspectives. So in my mind, it definitely is a science.
So what do you think? You can agree with everybody, or?
Yeah, I might as well. Might as well keep going with it. Yeah, well, I just think like it's hard to argue that it's not a science because like we do empirical research all the time in psychology, and we're constantly trying to learn more about the brain and doing different experiments to find out if we do this, what will happen, if we do this, what will happen. So it's hard for me to like wrap my head around how it wouldn't be a science. Like we are studying something and we are doing research with that, so.
Well, let me ask this question. Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah, well,
Zach.
Well, the process matters. Using the scientific method and everything is a huge part of all of this. But science is all about determining what's true, and what also matters is results. And I think in a world where psychology is not scientific, we haven't learned anything now that we didn't know before the study of psychology was a thing. And we know a lot more now. We are much better at treating things like mood disorders, even if we're not perfect at it yet.
Well, and branching off of that, one of the things that you had said before about psychology just being an elaboration of the obvious, I think that we've definitely gone beyond that. I feel like there's a lot of studies that have come out from psychology where we're just blatantly surprised. We're like, I didn't know humans worked like that, you know? I didn't know that was a thing. And I feel like for the results section of being a science, like we have found things through psychology that have predictive value that can tell us like how people are going to respond to different things, how certain treatment will interact with different kinds of people. And I think that's very valuable and something that is worth having. So like, yeah, I don't know where I was going to end that, but
No, that works.
Psychology is a science.
Yeah.
I think that is definite, though.
Well, I think it's ironic that the person with a PhD is the one who's saying psychology is not a science. But I think that one of the criticisms is that psychology changes every 30 years. That it was studying, so the earliest psychologists, the structuralists and the functionalists, were studying things like perception. And then it becomes behaviorism, so that's all we're studying. We're running rats through mazes. And then it's the cognitive revolution in the 60s. And so then we're studying decision making and that sort of thing. But it's, and the way if we think in terms of clinical treatment, that changes all the time too. And that things go through fads. So one minute it's everyone's a psychoanalyst and it's Freud. And the next minute it's cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis.
But isn't that part of science? You learn to ask better questions. Like, I'm not a biologist or a computer scientist and can't really speak to the other sciences. But I would assume that they have changed over time as well. And psychology as a science is a relatively new science. You know, people have been studying animals and studying like the human body and studying things like that since they discovered them, you know.
I would say medicine in particular is full of fads, and I think most people consider medicine to be a science.
Especially when they're sick.
Or how about even like the solar system, Pluto. Pluto was a planet for how long, and now it's not? Things like that.
Right.
I mean,
Physics is fake.
Is it not?
I had a conversation with a math major last year that blew my mind. They were talking about like the foundational theorems of mathematics and how they haven't been proofed. Like, they're not actually proven. They're just like, well, if we assume this, then we can assume every other thing that math has ever produced. I'm like, math is not certain? What? That was the one thing in life I thought was certain. The one thing you could depend on and say, yes, it is true.
Well, what I tell my students is, if you're looking for truth, then you shouldn't be taking a psych class. You have to take philosophy of religion. And that's a line from Risky Business. If there was any justice in this world, truth would be a 4-letter word instead of a 5-letter word. Let me throw this out too. My advisor in graduate school used to say that we never actually resolve anything in psychology. We just move on to another question. And so I don't know that that's accurate either. There was the replication scandal in psychology within the last couple of years too. And so maybe it's like, as they say in counseling, it's progress, not perfection. Other thoughts about whether psychology is a science?
think that's a good way to end
Yeah, that's a
it.
good closing statement.
Is it? Well, I hope this wasn't too spooky. And we'll say happy Halloween. And thank you for joining us. Oh, we want you to please subscribe, like, and comment below on whether you think that psychology is a science. And thanks for joining us. Okay, very good.